Alright, this is Mr. Singleton, and today we're going to be looking at a lesson on making inferences. This is a skill that you're going to need for most tests that you take, and also just for any kind of questions that you're asked, and just in real life we make inferences all the time. Let's start with what an inference is. The definition of an inference is to come up with an idea about something using the evidence available. So, for instance, you could use it in a sentence like this: I tried to infer what the theme of the story was based on what happened to the main character. That would be an example of using inference in a sentence. So let's look at these cartoons, and you'll see that you make inferences all the time. When we look at a cartoon like this, what makes it funny is that we're making the same inference, and we're making the inference that the author or creator of the cartoon wanted us to make. Remember, an inference is looking at the details of something, looking at the evidence in the item, and making an educated guess based on that evidence. So we can do that with this comic here. Take a second, pause the video, and look at this cartoon and see if you can make an inference based on the evidence about what might happen next. Go ahead and pause right now. Okay, hopefully you looked at some of the details of this drawing, right? You looked and you saw that there's this monster sleeping underground, and that only a small piece of his tail is sticking up above the ground, and it's surrounded by all these pieces of garbage, right? And then we have this poor guy walking along with his sharp pointed garbage picking up stick. And he's got a bag where he's inserting the garbage. And when we look at all those clues together, most of us would infer that what's going to happen is as he goes along picking up this trash, he's going to poke the tail of the monster. And when he does that, he's going to be standing in the perfect position that when the monster awakes and reacts, he will come out and like attack this guy or eat him. That's the inference that most of us would make. You just used the details in the drawing to make a guess at what was going to happen or what's going on. That's the type of thinking that you have to use when you make an inference. Let's look at another one. Again, we can look at the details of this cartoon, and from those details, we can make an educated inference. So let's try that again. Go ahead, look at this cartoon, pause it, and see what you can come up with. Go ahead and pause it. Okay, hopefully what you saw was you looked at these signs, right? You particularly looked at these circles here. These look like footprints, right? And then there's the circles that indicate something has fallen in this pond. And clearly, from those details, we can make an inference, even though there's not somebody drawn in the picture, that somebody walked along here and fell into the quicksand because these signs were pointed in the wrong direction. We make an inference. Let's try it again. Try the same thing on this one. Go ahead and pause it and see if you can make an inference on what they're going to do today. Obviously, the detail here is we can see that they're on a desert island. We can see that this island is filled with sandcastles and not much else to do. I think we can make an inference that what they're going to do today is build another sandcastle, right? That's all these guys are doing on here. We made that inference. It doesn't come out and tell us that directly. We have to work for it a little bit. We have to look at the details and think about it, but we all draw the same inference or conclusion. Let's look at one more. I like this one in particular. Okay, take a second, look at this one, pause it, and see what details you can make an inference from. Okay, so this one says, Muffy, you're not human, you have no idea what it's like. If we were going to make an inference about how this guy was feeling, what details could we use? I think my favorite one here is that if you look underneath his eyes here, there's this extra line. And I think just from that one line we can make the inference that this guy's maybe stressed out, right? His eyes are big, and that one little line, that one little detail, we can make a big inference about how this guy is feeling. This reminds me of a comedian that I saw, and he was drawing pictures and talking about how much from just small details we can change what a picture means, right? And he drew a coffee cup, kind of like this, okay? And he said, we all know that that's a coffee cup, but just by adding some little details, we can add to make inferences about what's going on with this coffee cup. For instance, if we add some lines up here, just by making those little lines, most people would infer that this coffee's hot, right? We could put some lines back here, and most of us would infer that the coffee cup is flying through the air. So just through small details, we can make a big inference. So this is one flaming hot cup of coffee flying right at you. Okay, hopefully that wasn't too awkward. So the idea here is that we can make inferences from details. If we can do that with just a line on a drawing, we can certainly do that when we're reading. From something a character says, from the way a character is described or the way a setting is described. All of these details give us evidence to make inferences with. And you're going to be asked a lot of questions that are questions that ask you to basically make an inference with them. So let's practice this another way. So let's look at the set of 6 checks here. And we notice that these 6 checks are written by one person, okay? And they're all for different things on different dates, and there's different details on the checks. What I want you to do is we're going to look at each one of these checks and we're going to look at the details of it, and we're going to see what story all 6 of these checks put together tell. So we're going to look at the details of the evidence, and then we're going to make an inference that when you combine all of the information on all 6 checks, if we can make an inference about what this person was doing. Okay, what are they trying to do with all of the information that we can gather here? So let's look through these. Okay, so the first check, we can look at all the details here, the date, the amount, the memo line. It's paying to the order of Ramirez Used Car Lot, and the memo says it's a down payment on a van. Well, there's one piece of evidence. Let's keep going. It looks like several days later, they wrote a check, the same person wrote a check for quite a bit more money. This check was to the city of San Antonio, and it's for a mobile vendor's license. Okay. Let's look at another check. A few days later, they went to the Sam's Club. They spent a good amount of money, and it says on candy and soda stock. Again, another big chunk of change they spent here the same day that they went to the Sam's Club. Apparently they went to West Side Ice Cream Wholesale, and it looks like they bought ice cream stock. Again, they went to this place, Custom Rides. They spent $400, and it looks like it says that they installed a deep freeze in the van. Maybe we're starting to get a picture of what's going on here with these details. Can we start to make an inference? Let's look at this last one. Looks like they went to the same place, and they spent $150 on the install of an external speaker. So when we think about all 6 of those checks, we can probably all make a similar inference. Take a second really quickly, pause, and see if you come up with an inference about all of these checks. Hopefully the inference you made is that whoever this person is, they are putting things together to start their own ice cream truck, right? A down payment on a van. They had to get a license from the city to sell. They had to stock it up with candy and soda. They had to stock it up with ice cream. They got that deep freezer installed in the van, as well as an external speaker to play those sweet ice cream van tunes. I don't know if you're like me. I always get excited when I hear the ice cream van tunes still to this day. It's kind of embarrassing. Probably shouldn't have shared that here. But basically, all we did there is we looked at these details. We looked at the little pieces of evidence there and we got a big idea from it. That's what we're trying to do when you're reading these questions on tests. That's what most of those questions are asking you to do. They're asking you to go back to the reading. They're asking you to look at the little details in there and then make an educated guess based on those details, based on the evidence. So let's talk specifically about these tests. It's one thing to look at cartoons and checks. It's another thing to see what this looks like on an actual test. So it doesn't matter what test we're talking about. The AP tests, the end of course or STAR test, SATs, ACTs, all these tests basically ask the similar types of questions when they're asking you to make an inference. So let's look at this a little more closely. There are some steps you should follow when you're looking at these questions to determine whether or not it's an inference question and what you should do. And the first step is to ask yourself, is this an inference question? In the question, look for key words and phrases. So obviously, if a question uses a word like suggest, imply, or no brainer right here, right? Or infer, then those are all words that are basically asking you to make an inference. So it might look something like this. These are the way questions that ask you to make an inference. This is the way some of those questions might be worded. Something like this. According to the passage, we can reasonably infer. Based on the passage, it could be suggested that. Which of the following statements is best supported by the passage? The passage suggests that this primary problem, there's that suggests, the author seems to imply that. These are all question stems that are asking you to make an inference. When you see questions worded similar to this, you know that your job now is to go back and look at the text and look at the details and try to make an educated guess based on the details. Now, sometimes they're a little trickier with it. Sometimes they may not have those key words that are going to show you that it's an inference question. Sometimes you may see things like this. With which of the following statements would the author most likely agree? Now, it doesn't say infer or suggest or imply, but that's clearly an inference question. Okay. How about this one? Which of the following sentences would the author most likely use to add additional support to paragraph 3? So while these don't come right out and say imply, infer, suggest, we can tell that they're asking us to do the same type of thing. To go back, look in the text, and base our answer off of some details in the test. That is an inference. And even when they try to get tricky on you, you should be able to figure out whether or not they're asking you to make an inference. The next step is to go back and actually, once you determine whether or not it's an inference question, if it is an inference question, go back and actually look for the clues in the text, right? You need to go back and dig for clues that you can base your inference on. The only way to answer one of these questions right is if you're basing it on something from the text. If you're just pulling the answer out of nowhere or you're just guessing, you're probably going to get it wrong. Go back and base it off of something in the actual test. When you're looking at readings and trying to make an inference from those, you can usually draw from things like descriptions or dialogue or the character's actions, vocabulary, supporting details, and many other things. You can find evidence to use for your inference all over the place in these readings. Here's an example that we can practice on. Let's say we were looking at a test and it had a question like this. Based on the information in the passage, it could be suggested, there's that key word, that the narrator believes Elsa's prior marriages to be A, uncomfortable but well suited to Elsa, B, satisfactory and dull to Elsa, C, cold and damaging to Elsa, or D, awful but worth it to Elsa. So we saw that key word suggested. So that tells us, okay, this is an inference question. We need to go back and look in the text. So let's look at the text that this question is about. Let's read it together. The widow Elsa was as complete a contrast to her third bridegroom in everything but age as can be conceived. Compelled to relinquish her first marriage after her husband died in the war, she married a man twice her years to whom she became an exemplary wife, despite their having nothing in common, and by whose death she was left in possession of a splendid fortune, though she gave it away to the church. Next, a Southern gentleman, considerably younger than herself, succeeded to her hand and carried her to Charleston, where, after many uncomfortable years, she found herself again a widow. It would have been remarkable if any feeling had survived through such a life as Elsa's. It could not but be crushed and killed by the early disappointment of her first groom's demise, the icy duty of her second marriage, and the unkindness of her third husband, which had inevitably driven her to connect the idea of his death with that of her comfort. So, we could draw a lot of different things from that passage, but these are the kinds of things you might notice. To find clues that point to the correct answer, look for those descriptions that would support those first adjectives in the answer choice. Here are some of the descriptions of her marriages in the passage. She became an exemplary wife despite their having nothing in common. After many uncomfortable years, she found herself again a widow. The icy duty of her second marriage and the unkindness of her third husband, which had inevitably driven her to connect the idea of his death with that of her comfort. If you look over here, we can look at these answer choices and see which one of these answer choices fit with those responses. Okay, so let's play this out a little more. So once you've done this, the third step is now to, based on that information, narrow down the choices and try to select the right answer, right? Cross out the answer choices that you know are wrong. So if we were to apply it to the one that we're looking at right now, it could look something like this. The last step to making a correct inference on a multiple choice test is to narrow down the answer choices. Using the clues from the passage, we can infer that nothing much was satisfactory to Elsa about her marriages, which gets rid of choice B. Choice A is also incorrect because although the marriages certainly seem uncomfortable based on the clues, they were not well suited to her, as she had nothing in common with her second husband and wanted her third husband to die. Choice D is also incorrect because nothing is stated or implied in the passage to prove that Elsa believed her marriages to be worth it in some way. In fact, we can infer that it wasn't worth it to her at all because she gave away the money from her second husband. Finally, we have to believe that choice C is the best. The marriages were cold and damaging. The passage states explicitly that her marriage was an icy duty and her third husband was unkind. We also know that they were damaging because her feelings had been crushed and killed by her marriages. Based on that evidence, we would be able to figure out that the correct answer is C, cold and damaging to Elsa. This is how we make inferences in a test situation. We make inferences all the time. We take the evidence that we have and we make these educated, larger guesses. We should not change that when we approach a test or questions based on reading. It's the same concept. You have to base your responses in actual evidence that's there. If you have any questions about how to do this, you need to make sure to talk to your English teacher. Figure out what you need to do to clear those things up so that you know confidently how to make inferences on these tests.